Hi, this is Debbie, and thank you for joining me. Today, I want to take a look at quick and easy ink blending. I don't ink blend often, and so I'm far from an expert, but I'll share my hints and tips I've picked up along the way and hope they might help one or two of you. Today, I'll be using a few supplies from the new Rainbows release from Simon Says Stamp. I've picked out three here that really grabbed my attention. Working from left to right, Shine On is a cling background stamp, Hello Sunshine is a clear stamp set, and Slimline Sunburst is a stencil. I love the on-trend sunburst image in each product. I thought that whichever of these three products you use, the sunburst image would look great on an ink blended background. I picked out a palette of Distress Oxide inks to work with: Scattered Straw, Fossilized Amber, Wild Honey, and Rusty Hinge. And this is my first tip. The Distress Oxide inks are so creamy, they go on so smoothly and blend together beautifully, and are my first choice for ink blending. My plan with this card was to have the large cling background off-centre, and so I aimed for the ink blending to be approximately placed around the face of the sun, with the darkest colour in the centre and working out to the lightest colour. I started with Scattered Straw, and with a Simon ink blending brush, worked the ink into a piece of Neenah Solar White 110 card. Another tip is that I chose a piece of card that was larger than I needed, so that I had the flexibility on placement of the sun's face by trimming the panel down once I'd finished. For the ink blending, I had the piece of card on a slick craft mat, and this is important, I feel, as it helps to bring the colour in gently from the sides. I use small circles as I ink blend and start at the beginning of the first circle off of the mat, bringing it onto the card. Of course, you can only do this around the edges. As you work into the centre, you have to start on the page, but I try and keep a light hand that is continuously moving as I bring the new colour in. The ink blending at this stage is rather blotchy, but I wasn't worried as I plan to go through my four colours and then come back down through the colours again to blend further. I did get a mark in the centre of the page, presumably from my fingers and opening the ink pads. However, I intended to make the centre of the sunburst a deep, rich, rusty orange, and so knew that the mark would be covered by the ink to follow. For the centre of the sun, I wanted a deeper colour, and so I blended in a little of the matching Rusty Hinge Distress ink from the mini ink pad. I find the colours of Distress ink to be more intense than their oxide counterparts, and so this is a good way to keep the same colour but increase the impact. I blended just a little of the Rusty Hinge Distress ink into the centre and then called it done. I trimmed the card slightly to fit into the Misty, and then aligned the Shine On cling stamps so that the face of the sun was over the rich rusty area. I then stamped the image in Nocturne ink and gently rubbed over the door of the Misty with a cloth to get an even pressure. The joy of working with smooth card and a good pigment ink is that it took just one stamp to get a lovely impression. I removed the card from the Misty and then started splattering. I started with white gouache and loved the pops of white against the warm ink blended background. I wanted to bring in some depth, and so squidged a little Rusty Hinge Distress ink onto a craft mat and used a damp brush to pick up the colour and splatter over the sun. However, I personally didn't like the way that the ink reacted with the background on this occasion. It went sort of a purple hue. However, I continued splattering around the sun rays, bringing in Lunar Black and then transparent red oxide Daniel Smith paints. To bring in more highlights, I used the white gouache I'd splattered with earlier and a fine size 2 synthetic brush, and lightly painted random lines between the rays of the sun. On one occasion I had too much paint on my brush and it rather blobbed on there. However, every mistake has a solution, and as you will see later, this mistake meant I had the perfect location to place a sentiment. I also splattered with Pyro Scarlet paint to bring in a little more heat into the colour scheme. I dried the panel again and then cut and scored a card base from Ivory Card. The large sunburst on the Shine On set directed me to using a 5x7-inch card base on this occasion. I trimmed the ink blended panel to be smaller than this, giving a nice clear border of card base all around the panel. I added foam adhesive to the back of the panel and attached to the card base. Because I was working with a larger piece of card, I used the technique of folding the foam backer tape back on itself in each corner and using these flaps to float the panel over the card base until I had it in place, and then start to press down and attach it. For the greeting, I turned to the Hello Sunshine clear stamp set, and I love the font on the Hello Sunshine sentiment. I stamped the greeting in clear embossing ink on Schoolhouse red card and sprinkled with white embossing powder. Now the thing with small skinny fonts is that some of the detail can get lost. In this case, the dot of the exclamation point was not defined. I used the tip of a craft knife to carefully create a gap in the white embossing powder and then heat set the powder with a preheated heat tool. I then used the craft knife again, this time with a clear gridded metal-edged ruler, and on a cutting mat I trimmed out the sentiment to a skinny strip and added foam tape to the back before aligning over the splodge of white gouache I wanted to hide. To finish, I added 3 spots of sequins, making a triangle around the greeting, using the appropriately named Crackling Fire sequin set from Simon. I kept the sequins in place with Gina K Connect glue. So there you go, a quick and easy ink blended background, which was the perfect foil for the Shine On stamp set. I'll leave links below in the video description to all the products I've highlighted today, as well as a link to the coordinating post over on my blog. I want to thank you for joining me today, and I'll see you next time.